for those of you, who are in the integration space, knows Jon Fancey very well. He's been a very long time integration person. I'll say I personally have known Jon at least for like over 10 years now. And he used to be with us on the MVP community. And then he joined the Microsoft a few years ago, and then he moved to Redmond. And right now he's leading a lot of the innovations that's happening on the Microsoft integration space, mainly around the Logic Apps and BizTalk and other areas of the Microsoft integration stack. We are really looking forward to the roadmap and what's coming ahead in the Microsoft integration space. With that, I wanted to pass it on to Jon to take it over. It's all yours, Jon.
Great. Thanks, Saravana. Great to be here. Especially in the current circumstances. I think it's awesome that we can all get together still in this way. I'm here live, not quite on campus, but I'm here in Bellevue, Washington, which is about 8 miles from the Microsoft campus. Thanks for the introduction, Saravana. For those of you who don't know me, I run the Azure Integration Services team. So I was the architect of Azure Integration Services a couple of years ago when we launched it. And I'm a group program manager here at Microsoft. So what I want to do now is just quickly walk you through what I'm going to talk about and then just get stuck in. As Saravana said, I'm sure you want to hear what's new, and I'm going to get to that a little later. But first, I want to set the stage and talk about the journey that we're on and where we're going, of course. And then I'm going to introduce a special guest, one of our customers, and then we should have time for some questions and answers as well. So if that sounds good, I'm going to kick off. The first thing I want to talk about is really this whole notion of cloud native, which is people have been talking about for a few years, has really come of age in the last year or two. And there are really 4 key facets to this when I think about it. The first one is really around this containerization and componentization. These things aren't necessarily new, but certainly the technologies that we use to realize them are relatively new. We've been componentizing things in computer science for decades, but the maturity we've reached now and the flexibility we have managed to achieve with that componentization is really quite dramatic. And this has been driven by the open source community with things like Docker and Kubernetes, but it's also the observability aspect of this, the recognition that once you have lots of moving parts, you need a way of managing that holistically. Otherwise, it feels like a bunch of moving parts. The second piece of this is really around open source and open standards, which dovetails into the movement around containerization, but also lays a foundation, in fact, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which owns a number of the standards which underpin modern cloud computing and honestly underpins a lot of what we do and a lot of what our industry space is doing around the integration all up. Things like Open API, Swagger, the ability to define and consume APIs easily, things like YAML for defining manifests for deployment, what your application consists of from a resource point of view. The third thing is serverless, the idea that I can actually ignore the infrastructure and have scale on demand when I need it and only pay for when I need it. Is actually critically important in terms of what's driving a lot of the movement in cloud native computing today. It's certainly a lot of what we do in our team, across a number of teams in Microsoft. We believe serverless is really the future of computing. And then the last thing is really around how do I do this? The notion of GitOps, a combination of GitHub, Git as a source repository, and then the mechanism tools, whether you're using Actions or whether you're using Azure DevOps, to be able to easily and rapidly change your applications and deploy them into production. This whole in and out of loop optimization, the ability to be able to do local development and then be able to deploy that to wherever I'm going to run things friction-free is really the goal here. And all 4 of these things have come together to enable us to build very sophisticated, distributed cloud scale applications that don't just have to run in the cloud, but could actually run in your own data centers across multiple clouds, a combination of SaaS and things that you build yourself, knitting together the very concept of what an application is in the modern world. And the 3 kind of aspects to this in the center are really around data and just the sheer explosion and management of the data in the cloud, the applications that you're building using these tools and these principles, and of course people. The people are the things that are the resources that bind these things together, that allows us to create business processes, automation and connectivity between customers and their trading partners or consumers and your software. But there's also a revolution going on in the workplace as well. One statistic I've put out there, which is really quite dramatic, is that we expect there to be 500 million new applications built in the next 5 years, more than all the applications built in the previous 40 years. So how are we going to do that? Because there simply aren't enough developers on the planet. And this is causing a seismic shift in the way application development is actually happening, not just because of the cloud native movement I just talked about, but because the tools we're using to build applications are changing as well. And we expect nearly 2/3 of all applications to be built in the low-code category within the next 4 years. This is the ability for things like the Power Platform to be able to build applications with a dramatically reduced amount of code necessary to get them functioning and get them into a production environment. And it doesn't mean they're any less sophisticated. It just means that the tools that you use to create these applications do a lot of the heavy lifting for you, so you can focus on the business logic itself without writing lots of code to scaffold those applications. But we still think it could be easier. We still think we can move faster. We still think we can be more productive. And the reason for that is, in this modern workplace revolution, around these three concepts of data, applications, and people, we're seeing different groups of people inside the same company, the same enterprise, coming together to build things and collaborate. The first one is traditional central IT. This is, the IT department who for many years has taken up the demand from the business lines to build applications for them and deliver them and maintain them and manage them. But what we're seeing is increasingly business IT growing up, where the know-how of the business exists to be able to build their own applications. And these tools, and certainly no and low code tools, are part of this story, enable them to be able to build applications without the same reliance as that happened in the past on central IT. But really the biggest group of people, nearly 1 billion people on the planet, when you look at the 900 million knowledge workers there are around the world, are the people who live in the company in the most distributed sense in the lines of business. These citizen makers, citizen developers, whatever you want to call them, people who can take these low-code tools and quickly and easily build applications for themselves and be self-sufficient, while still having the ability to have governance at the central IT level or the business IT level, but being enabled through these tools to build things for themselves. And this concept goes by various terms, but this idea of the fusion teams, 3 teams coming together from different people across the organization to be able to build applications and collaborate. And the standards that I mentioned, things like the AML and other things, are often the underpinnings of these applications. So that's what allows the sharing of the artifacts that are being created between these different groups to be able to put all of that together. But of course, what's really underpinning all of this is integration. Integration in the broadest sense, everything from traditional app to business to SaaS, to IoT, to data analytics, and then the people aspect of this. Things like RPA, approvals, task automation, the ability to automate business processes, automate manual repetitive tasks is really something that's been exploding over the last few years. So integration really is everything. Back at the start of the year, the Software Development Times made a prediction that 2020 was going to be the year of integration. Now, for all of us here, it probably feels like the last 20 years have been the year of integration. But the combination of the ease of use of these tools for citizen developers, these no and low code tools, the ability to use cloud computing to have a higher degree of productivity, using things like Azure integration services on our platform to do this, and then the binding together of these different personas into a singular platform that spans different parts of the organization and spans different parts of their ecosystem, whether it's on premises or the cloud, is really what is making 2020 the year of integration. Now, of course, what's interesting about this is that this was a prediction back in January, which feels, given what we're all currently living through, a really long time ago. But I think it's, we can all believe that things are really coming together for integration. And part of that, and really for the largest part of that, is what we call Azure Integration Services, the set of capabilities that we bring together into integrated and cohesive tool set. Logic apps for workflow, Event Grid for event-driven invocation. Whether you're using Logic apps to consume events or Azure Functions to consume events, it doesn't matter, it's your choice. Data Factory for being able to extract, transform, and load data. And of course, API management to enable you to plug into the API economy, to create, publish, or consume APIs in a natural way using a uniform interface backed by industry standards, and then Service Bus for messaging to allow you to do loosely coupled pub/sub type messaging, as well as in-order delivery and all the other things that you need from an enterprise application and integration platform. But just looking at this cloud continuum, because this is crucial in terms of how these teams can work together across an organization. From one side, which is optimized for citizen development, to the other side, which is optimized for the pro devs. But really, this is sort of splitting up the same person into different personas. Us here at Microsoft often use these two sets of tools in the same solutions or for different purposes, simply because they're the best tool for the job. So we don't necessarily see an either or here, but we see it both, where citizens can reach for tools that are optimized for citizen development. And part of that is because they're optimized for knowledge working applications like Office or like Dynamics, whereas on the other side, in the pro dev space, they're optimized to use for Microsoft Azure or obviously our cloud platform. But in the middle space is this collaboration point. And in the case of Logic Apps, for example, and Power Automate, you have the ability to use the same no-code declarative workflow format and take it from Power Automate to Logic Apps seamlessly. So you can just take those artifacts and move them across, which means they could be something that somebody in the business creates that then moves to central IT. And it's the same for the way connectors work. I can actually trade a Logic app, turn it into a connector, and then consume that from Power Apps. So we have a lot of differentiated experience for different personas in an organization, but the same underpinnings underneath all of this tool set. Okay, so let's move ahead in terms of where we're currently going with this. Just one example, and we're going to spend the next 3 days really deep diving into this across the teams at Microsoft here in the product groups. So I just want to give you a quick high-level pass of what we're going to be talking about. The first one is Logic Apps, which you see here. This is the Logic Apps Designer. Hopefully many of you are familiar with this. But what we've done is actually made this rehostable on the Azure Functions runtime. Now, the reasons we did this were threefold. We wanted the ability to be able to run Logic Apps anywhere. So anywhere the functions can run, which is either in Azure, either standalone on bare metal VMs, or you can run it as part of App Service, or in Kubernetes, running in your own environments on-prem, or in a local dev environment where you're using VS Code and you've got that local dev loop of authoring and running Logic Apps locally. So we wanted a great dev experience as well as having a great ability to run it wherever you need to run them. And the third is we wanted a great performance experience to drive new workloads, which you wouldn't necessarily reach for Logic Apps as it runs today, but with something called stateless workflows, we now have dramatic performance improvements for Logic Apps. And this is something that we have just released in private preview. So I'm throwing up the link here. You can sign up today. We are onboarding people in groups, but I encourage you to visit this URL and just fill out the quick form. And we'll try and onboard you as soon as we can. This literally went out on Friday, so just before the weekend. The next thing I want to talk about is something called Automation Hub. Now, Automation Hub is the concept of being in the Azure portal, having all of my resources, because the portal is really around resource management, and being able to automate some of the tasks around that resource management. So for example, I can just rock up to a resource that I have, maybe it's a VM, and I'll see a set of templates, and maybe I want to send myself an email when a VM has stopped, or maybe I actually want to run a script on a schedule. Maybe I want to start a VM at the beginning of the day and stop it at the end of the day and save myself some money, if it's the case of developer VMs. All of these things are possible today, but they just require you to kind of do all the work yourself. With this experience, you'll be able to click one of these templates and it'll automatically, through configuration, a few clicks, a few steps through a wizard, and it'll create the task for you and then show you the list of tasks that you've created. But underpinning this is actually logic apps. So when you see your list of tasks, you can see how often they're running, you can see the types of tasks you've got. You'll be able to go behind this and look at the logic app that was created for you and edit and author that and extend that to your heart's content. But we want to get logic apps authoring experience out of the way for those customers who use the Azure portal, the millions of people who do that today, without getting in the way of creating the task, getting in the way of what you're trying to achieve. And then you can go back afterwards and look at how it was implemented and extend it. And that's something that's coming very soon over the summer period. And we'll be talking more about this, of course, this week in our sessions as well. The third thing I wanted to cover is something called Dapr. So Dapr is called the Distributed Application Runtime. It is a cloud-native way of building distributed microservice-based applications. And one of the things we literally just released last week is the ability to be able to integrate Dapr with logic apps. So Dapr is now powered from a workflow point of view with Azure Logic Apps. The ability to be able to now use logic apps and fire from the bindings that we have in Dapr. So maybe some things that we don't have in logic apps today, like Kafka, you can actually trigger logic apps now for in the Dapr framework and be able to author microservices in any language you like, whether it's Go or Node. I mean, Dapr itself is actually written in Go, or Java, or any language, and integrate that with logic apps, running in a container in your own environment or in the cloud. And what does that look like? Well, it looks kind of like this, where there's no magic here, there's nothing different, where I can load logic apps into a host, into a container, and then it loads the Dapr sidecar, which gives me the communication channels between the different microservices I have in my distributed environment. And Dapr acts as that shim to enable me to transfer control in and out of logic apps. So I can fire a logic app from one of the Dapr input bindings that's shown here, whether it's Event Hubs or whether it's Kafka or whether it's RabbitMQ or something else, even AWS, SQS. I can run my logic app and then return data back. So it's a super seamless experience, and that's something I'd encourage you to check out as well at the URL that I just popped up on the screen here. Okay, I'm going to keep moving on. So there's something that is brand new that we haven't talked about publicly before, is the Logic Apps SDK. Now we have an SDK already, of course, which deals with CRUD operations at the resource level. So I can do get and put operations on a Logic App definition. You could take the JSON template, which is the Logic App definition, all of the steps and actions and everything in it, and then you can just deploy that. You can do a put on that, or you can get a get resource to read it. But this goes further than that. The code sample I have here actually shows how I can create a logic app in code. So imagine this is an Azure function now that I can use the SDK to author a logic app. You can see how simple this is, where I just do create new logic app, then I append a trigger. The trigger is a scheduled trigger, and has a frequency type of an hour and a value of 1. So every hour this logic app is going to run, and then I can append actions to that logic app. So I can append an HTTP action. In this case, I'm just using postbin as a URI. I give it the post data and the verb of post, and then I can send a response back to myself, save the thing, give it a name, run it, and then throw it away if I want to throw it away. So a very dynamic way of being able to create logic apps in code. And actually even load existing logic apps, because we have a set of full CRUD operations for this. We're intending on releasing this open source out on GitHub, so you can take a look at in the logic apps repository. And you can load an existing logic app and then manipulate it, and we'll deal with all the rewiring of dependencies if you add a step or move a step around in code before you save it back out again. Okay, another thing is coming very soon. But what if you're still on premises? How can you be cloud native if you're on-prem? Well, you know who I'm talking about. What about those of you who are running BizTalk? So I'm super excited today to talk about something we're calling the BizTalk Migration Tool, or BizTalk Migrator. This is a tool we're working on right now, and we're going to give you an early look at this later today in the sessions coming up. But I just want to talk you through how this works, because I think this is something that a lot of you have been wanting for a long time. The way this works is that through the tool, it has a number of phases. So the first phase is an assessment phase where it'll actually discover, it'll take a look at your BizTalk environment, pull in all of the configuration information through the MSIs that are exported out of that environment, parse them out and do an analysis on them and actually generate a migration report for you. And that report will show all the things that it can do and the things that it can't that require some manual effort post-conversion. Because that acts as an input to the next step, converting that BizTalk application into an Azure Integration Services set of resources that is a manifestation of the same functionality. And then there's a final validation or verification step where you can run tests against that to make sure the inputs and outputs are exactly the same as they were when it was running in BizTalk. So sort of one high-level example of this, of mapping from a BizTalk application to an Azure Integration Services application, looks a bit like this, where we generate automatically logic apps that mimic the control flow through BizTalk. There is no message box in logic apps, so we simulate that with things like Service Bus and Event Grid for subscriptions and event triggering, and then generate the logic apps of the control flow, which may be implemented in orchestration or in a pipeline, or the mapping that happens either end of those pipelines automatically for you. Now, this obviously isn't going to do everything, but we do expect this to give you a really good head start in being able to take existing BizTalk applications and do an initial conversion of those, an initial assessment of those, enabling you to move those to Azure Integration Services. Okay, we're also going to be open sourcing this tool, and we plan to release this later this year in the autumn time. So let's look even further ahead. Let's sort of start really sort of looking way out. So one of the things we talked about at Ignite recently, about 6 months ago, was something called Azure Arc. So Azure Arc is the ability to be able to create an agent in any Kubernetes cluster. It sort of implants itself and then allows it to be managed from Azure. So it connects that Kubernetes cluster wherever it's running on premises in another cloud, GKE or AWS, doesn't matter. And it allows you to deploy and configure that Kubernetes environment. And that gives you a number of advantages. It gives you the ability to do things like centralized management, where you can take all your Kubernetes clusters that run across the different environments that you have, wherever they are, and give you this idea of at-scale control, where it doesn't matter how many you've got, how many moving parts you have, going back to what it is to be cloud native, and gives you the management over the top of that, things like Azure policy and governance, so that you can control and understand those environments. And of course, using GitHub as part of the deployment pipeline for that as well, so that you can manage those environments wherever they live. Now, why is this relevant? Well, the reason this is relevant is because when you look at what we have today and the sheer volume of services that we have in Azure, there's a lot of choice. It can often look a lot like this, and simpler is always better, right? So when we boil this down and look at the number of constructs, the number of primitives that you need to build applications, there's really only a handful that you need. There's workflow, which is something that, of course, Logic Apps fills today. There's messaging, which I talked about already, the ability to loosely couple systems, do things like load leveling, do things like order delivery, do things like publish and subscribe, to create that loose coupling between different systems, even on different platforms through an API-driven approach to make it heterogeneous. There's events which allow you to trigger even the creation of resources before dispatching work to them in the case of functions, to have a full event-driven scale, which enables things like Azure Functions to actually scale up to meet the demand as the load increases. APIs for being able to have a standardized way of publishing and consuming pieces of functionality wrapped as an API to build up your application, which could be complete composite of pieces you own and pieces that even you don't own that are actually implemented by others inside or outside your organization. Through the scheduling, timing is important. You want something to run on the first Monday of the month, or you want something to run every 5 minutes, so you only want one of them to run at a time, you need to think about scheduling. Of course, we have that as well. And the final thing is code. You know, the ability to be able to implement applications, just writing code in your favorite language, using all of these other 5 constructs to do that is really all you need to build any type of application and any type of integration between those applications. Because when you think about it, an application itself, when you look at it in this way, is really an integration of a set of components that you're building, whether they're pre-existing that you're wiring up through APIs, or whether you're taking existing SaaS applications that you're implementing and wiring up those APIs, or a combination of the two, including writing your own microservices and something like Dapper. It doesn't matter. All of this stuff all comes together with what you define and draw a box around it as an application. So when you look at what an application platform looks like, kind of projected on top of that, you see an API layer, and then you see the data we talked about as being central to what you need. You need some kind of state through being able to write code in something like Azure Functions, being able to orchestrate calls between APIs using workflow, and being able to containerize this on top of Kubernetes. And Azure Arc really fills this management layer underneath this, which gives you that unified management and governance. So as we go forward, you'll see more and more things moving to Kubernetes, just industry-wide, because it's so flexible in a way of being able to host things wherever you need to run them, whether they're on premises or whether they're in your favorite cloud, and hopefully your favorite cloud is Azure. But the operational side of this is also important, using things like Azure DevOps or GitHub to be able to implement your CI/CD pipelines so you can get things to production at minimal friction as often as you can. You know, the world has changed from deploying every month or every week to every hour, even in some cases even more frequently than that. As your maturity grows as an organization to make smaller, more rapid changes, so you make those changes more often. And this platform and this set of principles, this lifestyle really encourages that. The modern IDE approach of using VS Code for cross-platform development, or Visual Studio on Windows, obviously key part of the authoring experience. And then the final piece, that additional ability to span parts of your organization and different personas in your organization, is the Power Platform, reaching every developer on the planet, not just those who would label themselves as professional developers. So with that, I want to introduce, make one final announcement, introduce James Blackburn from Marks and Spencer. James is a principal architect, and hopefully he's right there. Take it away, James.
Hello. Hello, thanks for the introduction, John. So what I wanted to just kind of talk you through is a bit about what we've been doing here at Marks and Spencer, just to talk you through some of the things about integration and what we've been doing, and really building on some of what John has been talking about. So for us, we kind of practice really what we call agile integration, and we make that up into 3 major chunks. Some agile themes, delivery teams, and delivery modes. And I'm just going to kind of spend the next few minutes walking through kind of what we do here. So our agile themes is architecture, as John kind of mentioned. You've got to build, if you're building for the cloud and building integration for the cloud, you've got to really focus on what a kind of cloud native architecture for integration looks like, and I'm going to touch on that during a little bit of this presentation. Combined with the architecture, we've got to have this kind of technology capability, so the build out of really a hybrid cloud and cloud integration technology working together. So John touched on, in fact, well, okay, so what about BizTalk on-premise talking to the cloud? Well, in our view, they are all seamless and part of the same single platform. But all of that and having great technology and great architecture is pretty useless if you don't have a great team and great processes. So what we like to call that we built out is a hybrid team for hybrid architecture. Now our team, we break that up into 3 delivery team areas. So something that we call frameworks. This is a bit of a kind of a hybrid of architects and kind of engineering and also kind of administrative type teams. And we really build out and maintain the core technology and the technology patterns underneath. So we'll take things like logic apps, wrap those in our patterns and make those deployable and consumable by other teams. We also have enterprise services. So we focus a discrete team on building those common services and APIs. So rather than like perhaps the SOA architectures of old, where you might have built it and they will come, this is very much we're building APIs and services based on consumer and being led by what the consumers want. And then in addition to that, yeah, absolutely, we still have a DevOps team that build and maintain those interfaces. But we deliver those through different modes. What we call on demand, so that's very much a traditional kind of request the DevOps team to deliver. We have a commissioned mode, which is really saying, hey, I've got a big program of work here. I might want my DevOps team and I might want some dedicated capacity in that team. You can do that too through a commission model. So you have a dedicated squad dedicated to you as a project owner, and you control the capacity rather than being perhaps slightly on demand, which is kind of a FIFO based model. Or in fact, we do support self-service, so using the framework to build your own integration. And those are very much focused on perhaps full stack developers. So taking some of our template, taking some of our framework technology and building their own integration. Now, I mentioned earlier on that our cloud native architecture is actually built up of a few components. And particularly, we still treat on-premise as much as a first-class citizen as we do with cloud integration. So cloud APIs, our cloud frameworks, and our on-premise platforms make up our whole platform in totality. Cloud APIs, we've been doing that for quite some time. We're about 4 or 5 years into our cloud API journey. So we really adopted our cloud API management quite early on, and we've now focused on turning that into a cloud business-to-business service. But not only, as I think John kind of touched on earlier on, is those ingress-egress north-south patterns are important, but so too is that kind of east-west, so the ability for cross applications to talk to each other natively across the cloud. When we first built cloud APIs, we built it based on how our consumers want to consume it. And sure, much of it under the covers was probably almost certainly built on a pile of sand. So we then flipped our focus to really flip how we actually turn that into some cloud integration technology. So we built our processes out on the cloud in 2 areas, focusing on our cloud gateway services. So how we kind of ingest and move our business to business into the cloud. But also that did include how we do that seamless connectivity to on-premise. Effectively, we deployed everything that we need to in Azure and through Azure Express Route, really extended our cloud and data center to one complete integration platform. When we talked about cloud transformation, which is the bits we're working on now, we really kind of see it chunked into 3 areas. How you do that kind of cloud native self-service and workflow. I mean, John touched on that earlier on. How you might want to use that, some of the things like the Azure Power Platform to drive some of those workflow and orchestration and build some of those self-service templates. We also originally split up our transformation on the cloud into 2 distinct areas. How we do what we originally called lightweight transformation, and we focus really there on serverless, so platforms like Logic Apps. But we also thought that there might be some complex transformation use cases that might perhaps startup times of things like Logic Apps might not be suitable, and we would have to build our own, integration platforms made up of containers, because we think of our platforms on the cloud are really a thing of the past as far as integration is concerned. Serverless combined with what you can do in containers will make up your platform as a whole. So that's why on the complex transformation, we see the line between that and serverless very much blurring at the moment. So that's why things like the DAPA framework really excites us, because it allows us to kind of really say there probably isn't a difference between what you want to do in complex transformation and lighter weight on serverless. But splitting it up like that allowed us to actually get to the point where we could actually say that when we moved our traffic, we actually flipped how we think about the cloud. So late last year, when we actually finally completed our B2B traffic, we actually locked off our data center effectively from all of our integration data flows. That means it's still very important. Integration is still very much processed on premise as it is on the cloud. But actually that meant that originally when we started the cloud as an extension, we're really in a process now where the data center is an extension to the cloud. All of our B2B traffic, all of our integration capabilities start off on the cloud, and it's the cloud that determines whether that data stays on the cloud, goes to another SaaS provider, or indeed will actually just bridge it back to on-premise. So very much putting the cloud at the center of what we do. Very, very powerful to kind of flip that way of thinking so that the cloud is the master. And as we start to get on our 100% journey to the cloud, and the data centers become less and less important for us. And that's all very nice, having some great set of technology, but as I said, it's a lot of it about what we do is about the people. So how did we actually achieve doing what we've done? I mean, we achieved this kind of core set of principles that allowed us to kind of evergreen our technology. So something that I kind of determined, that always on architecture. And what I mean by that is we actually built for failure, not for success. So we actually assumed that things were going to break. We actually assumed that we would have to do cross-region. We'd have to actually assume that we'd need to deal with the fact that things might always work the first time on the cloud. Just go back a second. Right. What we also do is we focused on events and APIs at the center, and all of that together while we patched, we had what I call continuous adoption by default. So we run at N version levels when we put things into CAS. We built everything as infrastructure as a code. So moving away from a DevOps to a GitOps approach, as John touched on earlier on. So everything, all our infrastructure is can all be coded. And yeah, it is true that integration runtimes can now be immutable and disposable on the cloud. What we also built is that hybrid team for a hybrid architecture. So making sure that, as I mentioned before, is administration and engineering as a single team. And how we actually drive that kind of self-service adoption by actually that team where I mentioned that DevOps team and that enterprise services team earlier on, we actually more approach it that they actually operate as integration as a consultancy now, supporting that ability for teams to self-serve. We thought self-service was important because the thing about a shared services team, although it's great for governance, it also means that the problem is that actually it can disable many teams, particularly those that are product-based teams that are always putting integration on the critical path of what they do. So we built the approach that says that if we could turn integration into a consultancy and those could build some of our core basic patterns and templates, they can actually sit there and use the same technology that we have. And we know that they can actually build a lot of that technology. So I'm now going to move on to the slide that Kim keeps wanting to appear all by itself. So what did we learn from all of this? As I said, it's all about the right team and how we move from DevOps to GitOps. And what I mean by that is we've mentioned before integration as code. We've actually put all of our integration and all of our services coded. So that means that everybody who wants to spin up a particular component, whether it's messaging on the cloud or whether it's a transformation component, can basically define all of that in GitHub, and our pipelines will build that up. That's supported by our kind of admin and architecture team that have merged into kind of a self-service delivery function, and SREs, so site reliability engineering, is something that we focus on as treating the platform as a whole. So as mentioned, we focused on automating everything, what I actually call a zero admin footprint. So although we've said that we actually architect everything and we put everything into infrastructure as a code, we don't actually maintain it when it's running. If you need to maintain it, you deploy a change to it. So everything is a forward deployment. We don't go in and kind of administrate or change any of the settings. So that means because everything is templated, we build what I call t-shirts, not snowflakes. So that means everything is built on t-shirt sizing based on capacity, whether it's small, medium, large, extra large kind of capacity. We don't kind of bespoke build anything. Everything's built on templates. As I mentioned before, we plan for failure. So we don't necessarily try and talk about high availability and disaster recovery anymore. We talk about what it is to be capacity recovery. So we might run split region workload, 80%, 20%, and so on. So you've got to think about what's your acceptable failure rate. So you've got to assume that you are planning that things will go wrong, and what is an acceptable failure rate to balance your cost versus solution. And as I mentioned earlier on, we went through self-service. We defined a lot of our templates and patterns that are all manifested in Git that teams consume. But just because you're going self-service should not mean chaos. So that's a real thing that our integration as a consultancy have driven, a competency of integration operating as a guild across many portfolios to be able to support them. So really, what I've tried to kind of discuss about is agile integration for us means 3 themes, 3 teams, 3 modes. Our cloud technology for us allowed us to provision, first of all, a kind of gateway services where we focused on the seamless connectivity and cloud ingress for business to business. And then we focused on cloud transformation capability. And also, we managed to achieve a central set of governance through patterns, meaning self-service shouldn't mean chaos. So with that summary, that's it from kind of M&S what I want to share. So I'm just going to hand back to Jon.
That's great. Thank you. See if I can get my video back. Awesome. Right. So what we wanted to do now is open it up for a bit of Q&A, but I had a couple of questions. It's all right. First, James. I think one of the things that's very obvious to all of us and why we're all here is the world's changed in the last 2 months, last 3 months. How has your cloud strategy helped Marks and Spencer's respond to the crisis, and how has that helped your customers?
Thanks, Jon. That's a great question. Obviously, as a retail organisation, it's been a challenging trading environment for us, where we've had part of our business hasn't been able to operate, but our foods business has. And as with any other retail environment, we're used to kind of having to plan for peaks and troughs. And actually being on the cloud meant that our integration of a framework and our integration capability didn't cause us any of the challenges. Sure, there were elements where we had to think about how much that was actually costing us to run, but actually in terms of component failure and component issues and basically being able to stand up and burst capacity, we've had no challenges at all with our business-to-business flow. We were fortunate flipping it across to the cloud meant us the ability that we were able to scale that very, very easily and support the bursts of data and the scale down in certain parts of it very, very, very easily. I think the challenge for us has more been about remote working and us all getting used to kind of dealing with calls and challenges through Teams rather than actually any worry about our core and underlying infrastructure, which is great for us.
Yeah, indeed. It's an amazing thing, right, to not have to worry about these things when you've got plenty of other things to worry about. What do you think you've learned over the last 3 months, and what might you have done differently?
I think what we've actually learned and come to learn is our ability to be able to define those sets of templates and scaling templates. I mentioned those T-shirts of small, medium, and large meant that we were able to very much react to that demand quite quickly when we needed to scale up and scale down. But I guess in terms of things to do differently, and it's actually things that we're working on now, is actually a real focus on the cost to run things. Particularly, we're focused now on what it is to real focus on our non-production environments. So to control some of our cost elements and our run elements, and provide perhaps some better support tooling to provide other teams to rapidly deploy and rapidly test some of our things. So although we've got a great production scaled environment, we're providing a lot of support for those people in non-production. So I think that's, our main learning is probably focusing much more on kind of testing frameworks.
Okay, I've got one more question. I don't see any in the Q&A. I'm not sure it's working, but let me ask one more, and then we'll wrap it up. How have your priorities changed given what's been going on from a business point of view?
Well, I think as a business point of view, actually overall, yeah, absolutely, our priorities have changed. Very much focused on focusing on, you know, our clothing and home business being traded out of a website rather than actually being able to have access to a lot of a store footprint, which changed some of the transactional dynamics of what we've got. So we've got a real focus now on making sure that some of our kind of our website traffic is given as much of an equal priority as perhaps some of our store processing. But absolutely, you know, it is interesting for us as well is what the current climate does for investment, as I'm sure we all are concerned about what that does for investment cycles and kind of what that means for us next.
Yeah, indeed, and it's something that we spent a lot of time thinking about as well. But what you thought you might have been doing this year probably isn't what you are going to be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, we think the strategy is still there, and you know, moving forward, it's just, you know, the timeline may just slide a little bit.
Yeah. Great. I really appreciate you being here, James. I think it's awesome to share your journey to Azure, to the cloud, and what that's meant for your integration environment, and how you've really been able to embrace that and take even more advantage of it, given the COVID-19 situation. So with that, you know, I just want to say thanks to everyone for being here. This really is one of our most fun events of the year from the product group's point of view. We love being there, we love being together, but we'll take this to in a virtual environment. We'll be hanging out in the forums and chatting with you over the next 3 days as well between sessions. The Microsoft community, you know, integration community really is an amazing thing. And I know a lot of us have been together for years and got to know each other. And for those of you who are new to this event, and clearly there's a lot of you this year, you know, I want to extend Saravana's welcome as well and just say it's great to have you here. And with that, I just want to say, you know, stay safe. I can't speak now. Stay safe and stay healthy. I hope you all have a really enjoyable time. You'll hear not just from Microsoft product groups, but from industry experts, from our MVPs as well. So I'm sure you're going to learn a ton of stuff, and we'll be together soon. Don't worry. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Covey.co